We're going to look at the first 5 verses tonight. Revelation 14, verse 1, it says, "And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder, and I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. And they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne, and before the 4 beasts and the elders. And no man could learn that song but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the firstfruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God." Now, chapter 14, what we see in chapter 14 is it consists of a series of visions that are given to John that all point to the ultimate victory of Christ. And we'll see this as we go through each one over the next several weeks. And so this particular one calls us back to the 144,000 that has popped up a couple of times in the book. But essentially, chapter 14 gives us a small preview of what's to come before John goes back to describing the contents of the 7th trumpet. The 7th trumpet was introduced back at the end of chapter 11. And then, as you know, we get into chapter 12, and it's kind of been a little bit of a parenthetical section. And so that ends with chapter 14. Chapter 15 will get back into the contents of the 7th trumpet, which is, as we'll see, the 7 vial or the 7 bowl judgments. And so we have seen in these chapters, in chapters 12 and 13 specifically, how Satan is going to attack, how he is going to conquer the world through the person of the Antichrist. And here there is given a word of hope. And that's what this is, a word of hope before jumping back into the horror of the end of the Great Tribulation, which is what's going to happen, and especially if you're one of the people that are there reading through this. And so chapter 14 gives some hope before the tribulation is to end. And so, as I said, the first vision here that John lists gives us another look at this 144,000 that we last see back in chapter 7. Now, there are 2 basic thoughts surrounding this particular text, verses 1 through 5 here. First of all, that the first thought is that this is depicting the 144,000 on earth after the tribulation has ended and Christ has returned. And so it's kind of a looking ahead, if you will. Or secondly, this is depicting the 144,000 in heaven, since we hear the voice of God and the music of heaven, or so they think. And so given the overall point of chapter 14, it would seem best to see this as depicting them on earth, and that this is not them in heaven, but this is them on earth after the tribulation has ended, after Christ has returned. And so furthermore, if this were to be in heaven, it would mean that they had been, at some point during the tribulation, it would mean that they had been martyred. I mean, that's the only way, at that point, they wind up in heaven. And so it would mean at some point that they had been martyred. And one of the points of the seal of God, that is referenced there in verse number 1, one of the points of the seal seems to be their protection. And so judgment, we understand back in chapter 7, judgment was halted before they were sealed. Back in chapter 7, verse 3, it says, saying, "Hurt not the earth, nor the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads." And so judgment was actually stopped before these people were sealed. And then furthermore, in the 5th trumpet specifically, we see that judgment was told to avoid those with the seal. It says, "And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads." And so those who did have the seal of God in their foreheads were not affected by this particular judgment of God. And so we see that the sealing has, at least part of its function was to protect this 144,000 through the tribulation. And so all of this together, it would lead me to suggest at least that this is happening on earth and not in heaven. And so here what is happening is John presents them as victorious. I mean, they have survived. They have lived through the judgments of God, and more specifically the attacks of Satan, and they've made it. They've gone all the way through. However, the important thing really here in verse number 1 is it's not just the 144,000 that are victorious. We don't need to miss the importance of the Lamb standing upon Mount Zion. This is in direct fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. One of these we're going to look at back in Psalm chapter 2. In Psalm chapter 2, if you want to turn there quickly, Psalm chapter 2, Starting at verse number 1, it says, "Why do the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure." And then verse 6 here, "Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord hath said unto me, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. Ask of me, and I shall give thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. Thou shalt break them with the rod of iron, thou shalt dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." So what we see here is God giving over to his son, setting his son as a king upon the holy hill of Zion before the millennial reign, and that is exactly what John seems to be suggesting here in Revelation chapter 14, and then another one in Joel chapter 2. In Joel chapter 2 it says, "And I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord come." And then it goes on to say, "And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered, for in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant whom the Lord shall call." And so it would seem that Joel is specifically referencing this particular group as the remnant whom the Lord shall call, that to be there with the Lamb as he is there on Mount Zion. So again, this speaks to the purpose of this particular chapter here in chapter 14, that Christ will reign victorious. And so the only reason that this particular group will make it to the end is because God wills it to happen. That's why they're going to make it. He seals them. It is his will. They're going to make it. Therefore, they are victorious because Christ is victorious. If Christ was not victorious, that inherently would mean that they would have no hope. But because he is, they do have hope. And because God is sovereign, they will last. And so again, this speaks to the whole purpose of this particular chapter. And so let's go on here, verse number 2. It says, "And I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of a great thunder, and I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps, and they sung as it were a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders, and no man could learn that song, but the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth." And so John describes a song that literally seems to burst right out of heaven. He hears the voice of many waters, and some will say that that's God, because there are similar descriptions in other places. Well, let me go on. He hears the voice of many waters, he hears the voice of a thunder, he hears the voice of harpers harping their harps. And so all of this points to the overwhelming and powerful sound of this music that is coming from heaven. Now, as I said, some think that could be a reference to God, that God is speaking here. And I'm not saying that undoubtedly it's not. However, it seems that when added together with the other references, this is really showing the amazing power of the song that is being sung, not necessarily the voice of God. And so both the water and the thunder speak to the strength that is being displayed by the sound that's coming, and the harps then come in to show us that this isn't just random noise. This is music, and it is powerfully strong. And so this heavenly throng, it says in the text that they sung as it were a new song before the throne and before the four beasts and before the elders. And so that whoever is singing it before these groups of people. And so this likely includes the church, the raptured church, those who have been martyred throughout the tribulation, and the angels, all singing together to praise God and Jesus for their great work of redemption. And now we understand, obviously, the angels, they can participate in that song only from the standpoint of praising God for what he's done, not from a point of experience, but they still praise God for the things that he has done. However, John also writes here that no man can learn it but that group, that 144,000. So that's a curious thing as to why this particular group, this group of 144,000, are the only ones who could learn this song, and not any of the other redeemed who will make it through the tribulation. And so really the only reasoning that we can surmise is that the purpose of this particular group is different than just I hesitate to use the word, but the normal person who will be saved during the tribulation. This group is different. Thomas Gospel, he put it this way: probably they were the only ones who could learn it, in the sense that they were the only ones who could appreciate what it expressed. God had purchased them from the earth for their special ministry in the Great Tribulation, not just for salvation. They were saved for a particular purpose that we'll look at here in just a little bit. It's not just kind of a general salvation and then a general calling of God. There was a very specific calling upon this particular group that is unique to them and no one else. And so as we'll see in verses 4 and 5, it shows that, again, as I said, this is a special group who was chosen for a special purpose. Now, their salvation was not different than anybody else. Their salvation was still salvation by grace through faith. That doesn't change. But their purpose was expressed a little bit differently than, again, most other, or really all others who were saved during this particular time. And so when we look at verses 4 and 5, we get some of the characterizations of this particular group, and we see what kind of makes them so special. And so verse number 4, and again, this is still in reference to the 144,000. These are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb whithersoever he goeth. These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. And in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. And so we see here, firstly, at the beginning of verse number 4, that they are pure. They are pure. They are not, as it says here, they are not defiled with women, and it goes on to say they are virgins. In other words, there's a purity here. Now, some interpret this to be spiritual. This is not literal in any sense. Some interpret it that way. This is just spiritually, and by that means that they have not been overtaken by the lust of the worldly system that was available to them at this time. Now, we can only begin to imagine how wicked things are going to be on the earth at this particular time, right? Being run by the Antichrist, who is basically Satan in the flesh at this point, and the religious system, and now the religious system of worship the Antichrist or die. All of this is going to be in play, and there's going to be just great wickedness as hell is essentially unleashed upon the earth. We can only begin to imagine the immorality that's going to be taking place, and all of these things are going to be happening. And so some say that this is just kind of a spiritual purity, and in other words, they are not indulging in the lust of the world system that is in place. And so they've been kept pure from the system of the Antichrist. However, simply by nature of their seal of God, we wouldn't need this statement. That would already have made that point. Right? We've already seen that if you don't take the mark of the beast, if you don't worship the image, you're being killed. And so just by the nature of the fact that they have not taken the mark of the beast, that particular statement is already made by that point. And so some interpret this simply to mean that they have remained sexually pure inside their marriage. They have not gone outside of their marriage, as it were. And this does follow a little bit. Hebrews 13:4 specifically tells us, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled. Clearly, this is how God intended that to happen, and within the marriage, that is not defiled in any way. And so they say this is in reference to these men who were married, and they kept it that way, therefore they remained pure. However, and I'm not really dogmatic on it, but I do think this is the case. I don't see any reason for taking this for anything other than it says. I don't see any reason why we need to spiritualize this and say that, no, it says virgins, but that's not really what it means. The word translated here, virgin, in verse 4, is almost always, across the board, almost always translated as virgin, because that's what it means. Furthermore, it makes sense given the time period that these men are so involved with the work with which they've been, led to do, that they're not leaving much of a time for relationship, especially considering they know their time is short before Christ returns. And then you add on top of that, 1 Corinthians, I'll put this up on the board, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul writes this to the church in Corinth. He says, I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the present distress, I say, that it is good for a man so to be. And he's speaking specifically about virginity here. He's speaking specifically about the topic of virginity. And he says there, for it is good for this present distress, for the present troubles that we are facing. And the church of Corinth was under great persecution. And he says, so basically for the time of persecution that we're in, it's probably a good idea for a man to just stay single and dedicate himself to the cause of God. And so it would seem that if they were under a persecution in the church of Corinth, what they're going to be facing in the tribulation is just that times infinity just about. And so it would seem like the principle would carry over. Now, again, I'm not dogmatic about this. I think that this is probably what it's in reference to. I always lean towards a literal approach anyways. But whatever the exact meaning is, it is clear that given all of the immorality of the day, these men will stay chaste, they will stay pure. And I think that's the point here of the beginning of verse number 4. But secondly, we see that they are followers of Christ. And so as we've been talking about, even in the midst of the world's most wicked empire that has ever existed, in the midst of the harshest persecution imaginable, and in the most demonic and hellish activity that the world has ever known, these men will stand strong and boldly follow the Lamb. And this is exactly what Jesus said ought to happen in Luke chapter 9. And he said unto them all, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Not only when it's easy, not only when it's convenient, but even when you're having to take up your cross, you continue to follow him, and they will be exemplary in this. And then at the end of verse 4, it mentions that they are first fruits. They are first fruits. They were redeemed there in verse number 4. They were redeemed with a purpose, and that purpose was to be a first fruit. Now, if you understand the purpose of a first fruit indicates that there's more to come, right? In the Old Testament, the Israelites would bring their offerings of first fruits, and the offering of a first fruit was to give an offering to God with the expectation of more harvest to come, right? That's the purpose of this. And so they were saved, redeemed to be a first fruit, and so out of their ministry, many will come to know Christ as they will. And back in chapter 7, when we last read about them, the beginning half of chapter 7 is about the sealing of this particular group. The second half of chapter 7 is about the countless multitudes that are going to have been martyred for their faith in Christ. And so it would seem to follow that perhaps that multitude that will be saved will be a direct result of the ministry of this 144,000, and the first fruits that they are is seen come to fruition in those multitudes that get saved out of their particular preaching ministry. And so they are first fruits. This is why they were redeemed. And then we see at verse number 5, they were honest. It says, and in their mouth was found no guile, for they are without fault before the throne of God. And so they simply spoke the truth of Christ. They didn't add to it. They didn't take away from it. Again, understanding the time, knowing that they didn't have much time, didn't leave them a whole lot of time to devise a lot of different programs and a lot of different evangelistic tools. They just simply preach the Word of God as it is, and they're just honest in their approach. Zephaniah, this is an interesting verse here. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 13. The remnant of Israel shall not do iniquity, nor speak lies, neither shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth, for they shall feed and lie down, and none shall make them afraid. And so perhaps that this is in direct reference here to this particular group, as they're honest in their approach. And that doesn't just refer to their preaching, but they were honest in word and deed. And so there's this word without fault here at the end of verse number 5. That word means blameless. It doesn't mean sinless. And there's a big difference. It means blameless. They do this only through the leading of Christ. And Jude chapter 1, verse 24, I love this verse. It says, now unto him that is able to keep you from falling, and obviously this is talking about Christ, and to present you faultless. And that's the same Greek word that is translated without fault here in Revelation chapter 14. And unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. And so they can do this. They can be blameless. They can do all of these things because of the leading of Christ. And we've already seen that they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And it's through his power and through his aiding and abiding that they are able to do the things that they do. And so we see that this is a particularly unique group of individuals that are saved at a unique time in history for a unique purpose. And they're a very fascinating group. And I'll simply end with this quote, and it goes on. I know it's long, but it goes on. It says, by John Phillips, he says this, no other age has produced a company like this, a veritable army of militant believers marching unscathed through every form of danger. It has been theirs to defy the dragon, to bait the beast, and to give the lie to the false prophet. Their calling has been to preach the gospel from the housetops, when even to name the name of Christ called for the most dreadful penalties. They have been surrounded, these Latter-day Jobs, with impenetrable hedges, able to laugh to scorn all the grand inquisitors of hell. They have walked the streets in broad daylight, careless in the teeth-gnashing rage of their would-be torturers and assassins, true witnesses of Jehovah in the most terrible era of the history of mankind. The devil knows about this coming band of conquerors and arrives already in agony of anticipation. And so we talked about this when we were going back over chapter 12. In chapter 12, it talks about the dragon and how he makes war against the woman and her offspring. And we talked about how in chapter 13 that he's going to be largely successful in that. He's going to come after Christians and particularly, I think, particularly Messianic Jews. He's going to come after them because he kind of doubly hates them. And so this particular group then is going to have a very unique ministry in that they are sealed, they are protected, and I'm sure that they are going to be a persistent thorn in the side of the Antichrist, who is going to hate them with an absolute fury, and yet will be utterly unable to do anything about them because of this particular seal and this calling of God. And so an absolutely tremendous group of people, and just a tremendous and interesting study with regards to this 144,000